What if the story of human civilization, as we have been told, started in the wrong place? What if the pyramids of Egypt were not the beginning, but a copy of something much older, something that was erased, buried, and changed? The desert, huge and quiet, holds its breath as if it remembers. Beneath its sand are not just bones and old pottery, but mysteries, buildings that seem to belong to a world that should never have existed. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And as always, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Somewhere, someone is falling asleep to this same mystery. Egypt, they say, was the beginning of history, a place where order came from chaos, where stone rose against the sky to challenge the desert. But when the wind blows away the sand and shows the stone beneath, questions begin to whisper through the silence. The Osirian at Abydos has blocks carved from red granite, stacked with amazing accuracy and weight that makes fun of modern machines. It seems much older than the temple built above it. Scientists admit that it doesn't fit neatly into any known building pattern. Some think it was built by Seti I around 1200 BCE. But the granite itself shows where that suggests rain. Rain that hasn't fallen in this part of Egypt for more than 10,000 years. And then there is the Sphinx, so familiar, so often photographed, that its mystery has almost become invisible. But its body, worn away and scarred, tells a story that disagrees with the textbooks. The Egyptologist John Anthony West and the geologist Robert Schoch once stood before it and saw what others missed. Patterns of deep up and down wearing away, like channels carved by water, not wind. To suggest that the Sphinx had once stood in a wetter, older Egypt, perhaps before the Sahara was even a desert, was to challenge everything we thought we knew about when civilization began. The mainstream answer came quickly: impossible. Civilization, as far as archaeology could prove, began around 3000 BCE with Sumer and Egypt. To suggest otherwise was like saying something forbidden. Yet forbidden ideas have a way of surviving, whispered by the stones themselves. For even if one refuses to accept the idea of predynastic architects, the question remains, why does the geometry, the alignment, the very direction of these ancient buildings seem to match star patterns that belong to a sky thousands of years older than the official record? The stars and the pyramids, the Giza Plateau, when matched to the stars, forms a puzzle of precision. The three great pyramids line up almost perfectly with the belt of Orion, not as it appears today, but as it would have appeared around 10,500 BCE, with the Milky Way mirrored by the Nile. Coincidence, perhaps? But coincidence repeated across continents begins to feel like memory. In the silence of the desert night, the idea becomes exciting, that the Egyptians inherited rather than invented, that their priests, their architects, their astronomers were guardians of something older, fragments of a forgotten science that had survived a worldwide disaster. Myths from across the world echo this same pattern. Atlantis swallowed by the sea. Zep-Tepi, the first time of Egyptian lore when gods ruled among men. The Sumerian tales of kingship coming down from heaven before the flood. Always the same rhythm. Rise, destruction, forgetting. But what if this forgetting was on purpose? What if the change from myth to history was not a natural change, but a cutting off, a deliberate forgetting, done on purpose to hide the ruins of an age too strange to fit the new story of human progress? The birth of history, after all, depends on what we choose to remember and what we choose to erase. Napoleon's discovery: when Napoleon's soldiers marched through Egypt in 1798, they discovered not a primitive desert kingdom, but something impossible to explain. They measured, recorded, and argued among themselves about the age of the stones. Some insisted the pyramids were older than Noah's flood. Others laughed at the idea. The argument never truly ended. Instead, it changed into something quieter, an agreement enforced by repetition. We began to measure time not by what we found, but by what we believed possible. And so, layer by layer, the sand became not just a burial ground for monuments, but for memory itself. The further archaeologists dug, the more contradictions they found. Petrified wooden layers that should not exist, polished diorite vases shaped with accuracy beyond the reach of copper tools, and block weights exceeding hundreds of tons, lifted with methods we still cannot copy without modern cranes. The explanations offered were practical. But the deeper truth was emotional. To admit the impossibility of these artifacts was to accept that history might be wrong. The Sphinx's age debate in the 1990s, when Schoch's geological findings brought back the debate over the Sphinx's age, the academic world closed ranks. Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities dismissed the claim, fearing the chaos that would follow if textbooks had to be rewritten. Yet outside of universities, the theory caught fire, not as fringe fantasy, but as a doorway to deeper questions. If the Sphinx truly came before the pharaohs, who built it? And what happened to them? Perhaps the answer lies not in Egypt at all, but in the changing face of the earth itself. Around 10,800 BCE, the planet went through a sudden and violent climate change, the Younger Dryas. Ice sheets melted, oceans rose, and coastlines vanished beneath the sea. If an early civilization existed, its cities would now rest miles offshore, buried under layers of mud and sand. The idea is almost poetic. The farther we advance, the deeper the truth sinks beyond reach. The desert remembers the desert is deceptive. Its stillness suggests it never changes, but everything beneath it moves. Sand shifting, wind erasing, time folding over itself. Sometimes archaeologists uncover a piece that feels out of place. A polished stone, a precision-cut groove, a balance too clean for chance. They measure, catalog, and file it away as an oddity. Yet oddities, when gathered together, begin to outline a ghost, the ghost of something that came before Egypt. If such a civilization existed, it did not vanish by accident. Perhaps it was swallowed by nature. A flood, an axis shift, a fire from the sky. Or perhaps it was buried by design, sealed away by those who inherited its remains but not its understanding. A few ancient texts, half erased and half myth, speak of gods who hid the sacred knowledge from mankind until it was worthy again. Maybe the builders of Abydos and Giza were not inventors but restorers, copying in stone the memory of technologies they no longer fully understood. And if that is true, then history is not a straight line at all. It is a circle, turning endlessly through remembering and forgetting, through light and sand. Somewhere beneath your feet, under miles of silence, the desert still hums. The stones remember rain. The Sphinx, half buried and half awake, waits, not for discovery, but for recognition. For the past, when denied, never truly disappears. It just hides in plain sight beneath the very story we tell ourselves about who we are. When the land speaks, there are moments when the land itself seems to speak. Not in words, but in quiet disagreement, as if the earth is trying to correct a lie told too many times. The Sphinx, its face worn yet unbroken, may be one such voice. Scientists once thought its wearing away was simple windwork, 1,000 years of dust and sand scraping the limestone. But then the grooves were studied more closely. Their shapes, deep, vertical, and uneven, looked less like wind scars and more like the gentle dissolving lines left by falling rain. But rain in the Sahara? That idea alone breaks apart the accepted story of when Egypt's monuments were built. Robert Schoch, the geologist who dared to say this aloud, faced ridicule. His findings suggested that the Sphinx might have stood long before the Sahara was dry, before Egypt existed, somewhere around 10,000 BCE. To his critics, that was absurd. But to others, it was electrifying. It meant that the first great monument of humanity might belong not to Egypt, but to a civilization we no longer remember. The Egyptologist John Anthony West described it not as a revelation but as a remembering. He believed that the ancient Egyptians inherited the relics of an older world, one that had understood the stars in ways modern minds barely touch. The Orion connection, and as night falls on the Giza Plateau, one can almost feel that memory stirring again. The three great pyramids standing silent against the horizon mirror the three stars of Orion's belt. It is not a vague resemblance. Their spacing, their sizes compared to each other, their angle, all match precisely to the pattern that Orion formed around 10,500 BCE. What does that mean? That whoever planned the pyramids knew the sky of a different time period, one far older than the pharaohs who claimed them. The astronomer Robert Bauval proposed this Orion connection in the 1990s, arguing that the pyramids were built not merely as tombs but as an earthly reflection of heaven. The Nile was the Milky Way, the pyramids were Orion, and the ancient soul in its journey after death followed the same star path. But if the builders used a sky map from 10,000 BCE, then they were preserving a memory of a time that, by all logic, they should not have known. The priests of Heliopolis spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled on earth, not metaphorically but literally, an age when civilization came down from the heavens, when architecture, language, and order were given to humanity as gifts. Later scholars dismissed it as myth. Yet the alignment of stone and star, the precision that binds heaven to earth in a single geometric breath, feels less like superstition and more like a message. Sacred knowledge in stone, perhaps those gods were not celestial beings at all, but survivors, carriers of knowledge from an age destroyed. If you stand between the pyramids at dawn, when the air cools just before sunrise, the sound of the desert changes. It swallows echoes, turns space into silence. One might imagine that the ancients built these monuments not merely for the dead, but to talk with something beyond, the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Every block, every angle, every chamber seems to hum with proportion. The Great Pyramid's base, when measured, contains both the distance around the Earth and the ratio of pi, numbers supposedly unknown to the ancient world. Coincidence, perhaps? But how many coincidences are allowed before they become a pattern? Ancient texts like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth speak of those who came before the flood, builders who raised the pyramids by the power of sound. Scholars call it metaphor. Yet when modern engineers study the sound properties of those inner chambers, they find echo frequencies that make human voices louder in standing waves. The stone box in the king's chamber hums at 117 Hz, the same frequency once used in sound levitation experiments. Coincidence again? And yet the mind resists letting go. Why were the pyramids aligned so perfectly to the compass directions, down to tiny fractions of a degree? Why do their measurements contain Earth's curve, sun cycles, and star alignments? The more precise the measurements become, the more unreasonable the explanations sound. To call it all a happy accident of geometry is almost an act of faith. Memory after the flood and faith, perhaps, is what replaced knowledge after the flood. When the last ice age ended suddenly, glaciers melted, sea levels rose over 100 meters, and entire coastlines vanished. What if the knowledge contained in the pyramids, the alignments, the sacred numbers, the heavenly connections, was a survival tool, a way to preserve the memory of cycles, of cosmic rhythms of time before time? Ancient civilizations across the globe, built in alignment with the heavens, the megaliths of Nabta-Playa, the temples of Angkor Wat, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the mounds of Cahokia. Different cultures, yet the same urge to mirror the sky. It is as if humanity remembered something deep, that the stars once spoke and we were listening. But over thousands of years, the meaning blurred. Temples became tombs, alignments became ritual, knowledge became faith. The stars still wheeled overhead, uncaring, while the desert buried everything beneath its steady hand. When Bauval presented his theory, he was met with both admiration and contempt. Archaeologists accused him of being romantic, of seeing patterns when none existed. Yet when satellite imaging confirmed the exact alignment of the pyramids to Orion's belt at the slow wobble date of 10,500 BCE, the dismissal grew quieter. Still, no institution rewrote the textbooks. It was easier to say coincidence than to admit that the ancients might have inherited astronomy from an age we refuse to accept. The wound of forgetting, perhaps this is the deepest mystery. Not the wearing away on stone or the geometry in the sand, but the human unwillingness to see time as a circle. Modern science builds upward toward progress, toward light. But ancient monuments face backward toward memory. They whisper of ages when light fell differently, when humanity rose and fell in rhythms like breath. If the Sphinx was once bathed in rain, if the pyramids were built to mirror a sky 10,000 years gone, then our history is younger than our memory. Somewhere, buried under dates and certainty, lies a break in time, a lost chapter that refuses to stay quiet. Maybe that is why even now the stars above Egypt seem to shimmer differently. They do not just light the desert. They light up a wound, the wound of forgetting. And in that silence, one can almost hear the echo of a voice that no longer exists, speaking to us through wearing away, through alignment, through impossibility itself. The stars have not moved. It is we who have forgotten how to listen. Cities beneath the waves. When a civilization vanishes, it rarely does so completely. It leaves traces, faint, stubborn echoes clinging to the edge of the sea. Sometimes those echoes wait for thousands of years before revealing themselves again. Along the shifting waters of Egypt's northern coast, the Mediterranean has kept such a secret. For centuries, fishermen told of stone pillars beneath the waves, of columns glimpsed through the shimmer of shallow tides. Few believed them. But then, in the late 20th century, sonar confirmed what legends had whispered all along. Entire cities lay beneath the Nile Delta. Heracleion, Canopus, Meneuthis, names that sound half myth, half memory. Once busy ports of the ancient world, now entombed in mud and shadow. When divers first went down into those waters near modern-day Alexandria, they found statues as tall as houses lying face down on the seafloor. Granite temples, sphinxes, hieroglyphs still sharp enough to read. Frozen mid-collapse, as though the world above had simply breathed in and never breathed out again. The French archaeologist Frank Gaudio led the team that uncovered them in 2000. What they found didn't fit the story. These ruins were surprisingly well preserved, and their design suggested cultural layers more ancient than anything recorded nearby. Columns bore both Egyptian and Greek designs, suggesting a long continuum, perhaps even a civilization that came before both and passed its knowledge forward like a fading song. Sunken mysteries around the world, but Heracleion was not alone. Similar discoveries began appearing across the globe, as if the sea itself was returning borrowed memories. In Japan's Yonaguni, divers stumbled upon huge terraces and steps carved from solid rock beneath the East China Sea. Some geologists argued they were natural formations, the sculpting hand of waves and time. Yet the right angles, the precise 90-degree cuts, and the matching stairways going down into the deep said otherwise. If these were natural, then nature had learned architecture. The idea of a lost coastal civilization, one that flourished before the end of the last ice age, began to take shape. During the Ice Age's coldest period, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today. Vast plains stretched where the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the South China Sea now lie. As the planet warmed rapidly around 10,800 BCE, huge amounts of meltwater surged into the oceans, drowning coastlines worldwide. Whatever cities stood there would have disappeared beneath the flood. Plato's dialogue spoke of Atlantis, a mighty island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that sank in a single night of fire and water. Historians often treat it as a story with a lesson, a moral tale about pride and decay. Yet Heracleon's drowned columns and Yonaguni's terraces suggest that Plato's myth may not have been invention but memory, a memory inherited from survivors of a disaster-filled age. Ancient cities older than we thought. In the sediments of the Gulf of Kumbat in India, researchers in the early 2000s discovered traces of geometric patterns, streets, foundations, and artifacts nearly 120 feet below the surface. Radiocarbon tests on associated materials hinted at an age older than the Indus Valley civilization itself. Doubters questioned the dating, yet the possibility remained. A city older than all known cities, erased by the same rising seas that had swallowed Heracleion. The flood myths of ancient cultures, the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hebrew Genesis, the Hindu story of Manu, the Greek tale of Deucalion, all share the same theme. Water rising, the world drowned, knowledge carried away in boats, in seeds, in fragments. Could these be separate memories of one global event? So, what kind of world ended that day? The Nile Delta's underwater ruins provide a clue. When the mud layers are analyzed, they reveal sudden layers of movement, whole layers of sand mixed with clay and marine shells. Evidence of rapid flooding, not slow wearing away. Something violent had pushed the sea inward, forcing the land to collapse. Geological records show that around 1200 BCE, an earthquake and tsunami struck this region. But beneath that layer lies another disturbance, older, deeper, unaccounted for. Perhaps this was not the first flood Egypt endured. Perhaps it was merely the last one we remember. Gods of cycles. Heracleian statues show gods that bridge time periods. Osiris, Isis, Serapis, deities connected not just with death and rebirth, but with repeating destruction. In temple writings recovered from the seabed, scholars found hints of older cults that worshipped the waters of Nun, the ancient flood from which all creation was said to come and into which it would eventually return. The Egyptians never spoke of a single creation, but of many worlds born and drowned in endless repetition. When viewed this way, the underwater cities are not oddities, they are witnesses. The worldwide spread of such ruins, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Cuba, near Malta, in the Black Sea, and around the Aegean, sketches a pattern that once would have been forbidden to suggest. A network of ancient settlements linked by trade, faith, and a shared understanding of the stars. Perhaps, as some suggest, they belong to a forgotten civilization whose memory planted the later myths of gods and heroes. A civilization that mapped the heavens, built with impossible precision, and died when the earth shifted beneath it. Who were they? But who were they? Some point to the builders of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a monumental site carbon-dated to 9,500 BCE. Its massive T-shaped pillars, carved and arranged with astronomical alignment, and its sudden burial, deliberately covered under earth and stone, remains one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries. Why would a society hide its greatest creation unless it saw disaster coming? Others suggest the lost coastlines of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean were home to seafaring cultures far older than Egypt, mastering navigation, stonework, and observation long before writing began. If they existed, the evidence now lies underwater, scattered across continental shelves like the fragments of a dream. Science can explain how these cities drowned, but not why their existence feels like remembering something we never lived. Perhaps the deeper question is not whether these places existed, but whether we as a species are willing to accept that we might be older, far older than we imagine. The human story may not be a straight line from primitive to advanced, but a rhythm of rise and fall, of knowledge won and forgotten. Civilization, in that sense, is not progress but recovery. The silence underwater, the divers who wander among Heraclean statues describe a strange sensation, as if the sea itself holds its breath around them. The light from their lamps glides over faces carved in stone, still calm after 3,000 years of darkness. Some figures seem to watch them back. The mud stirs like memory awakening, and somewhere far below, the ruins murmur a single truth. Nothing truly disappears. It only waits for us to remember. Marks that don't belong in the hush of ancient quarries and half-buried workshops. There are marks that do not belong to human hands, at least not the kind of hands we imagine when we think of copper chisels and stone hammers. On the high cliffs of Aswan, where pink granite bleeds under the sun, lies the unfinished obelisk, a monument abandoned mid-creation. It measures over 40 meters in length and weighs more than 1,200 tons. A crack stopped its construction, freezing time in place. Yet the way it was being cut raises more questions than answers. The tool marks curve with machine-like precision, following arcs too smooth for hand tools, as if a giant saw had sliced through the granite in rhythmic strokes. Mainstream archaeology says the ancient Egyptians used diorite pounding stones, striking for weeks until the rock gave in. But to those who've examined the grooves, deep parallel lines, uniform in depth and spacing, the explanation feels incomplete. Chris Dunn, an engineer who studied the site, proposed that these cuts were consistent with a form of advanced drilling or sound vibration, tools that could make stone vibrate at specific frequencies, reducing its strength. To many scholars, this was forbidden thinking. Yet the stone itself is fair. It records only what happened, not what we are comfortable believing. Impossible artifacts, similar mysteries lie scattered across Egypt. At Abu Rawash, pieces of granite show circular drilling marks with a spiral depth pattern, suggesting drill speeds and pressures that modern diamond-tipped equipment would struggle to copy. In the Museum of Cairo, precision-carved vases made from diorite and schist, materials harder than steel, rest behind glass. Their thin walls and perfect balance would challenge today's machines, yet they were supposedly created with copper and sand. Some were discovered in tombs before the dynastic period. Others have no origin record at all. Who made them, and why do they appear so out of place? To dismiss them as curiosities is to ignore the quiet logic they represent. These artifacts are not decorative extras. They are precision made solid. The work of hands guided by knowledge we no longer possess. Perhaps the Egyptians inherited them from those who came before, those whose names were erased by flood or time. The same builders, perhaps, who shaped blocks at Puma Punku in Bolivia, where andesite stones, each weighing dozens of tons, were carved with machine-like accuracy and fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Thousands of miles apart, yet echoing the same language of geometry and perfection. It is as if the earth once spoke in a single architectural language, later broken apart by disaster. A different kind of technology, what kind of civilization could achieve this and leave almost nothing behind? No engines, no metal remains, no tools, only precision, the residue of mastery. Some suggest that what we call technology might have looked different in that age. Not mechanical but acoustic, not industrial but harmonic. Ancient myths often describe gods using sound to move mountains, to lift stones with words or tones. To us, it reads as metaphor. But modern experiments show that vibration can indeed affect matter, that standing waves can make sand dance, that sound frequencies can levitate droplets, that vibration can cut through rock. Could the forgotten engineers have known such principles not as myth, but as craft? Inside the Great Pyramid, the king's chamber vibrates at 440 Hz, a pitch that aligns with Earth's natural Schumann frequency. The granite beams above vibrate slightly when sound passes through, making tones louder in standing waves. Was this coincidence or intention? If the pyramid was meant as a machine, not a tomb, its purpose may have been energetic rather than burial-related, a device harmonizing with the planet itself. But if this was technology, it was technology born from nature, not forced upon it, a science of working together rather than control. Chambers that sing in forgotten texts from Egypt, there are whispers of the sound that opens stone, of the voice of the builders who sang the blocks into place. We interpret them poetically because the literal reading feels impossible. Yet perhaps that impossibility is the very wall between our age and theirs. For a civilization that understood vibration, every stone was alive, capable of vibration, memory, and motion. At Saqqara, the ancient step pyramid of Djoser contains chambers carved in ways that produce deep humming echoes when spoken into. Modern researchers have recorded harmonics that align with specific vowel sounds of the Egyptian language, as if the architecture itself was tuned to human speech. The walls seem to answer. Could these chambers have been part of some ritual science? An attempt to interact with matter through sound and voice? Across the ancient world, similar patterns appear. The stone circles of Nabta align to solstices. The megalithic temples of Malta designed with echo areas that make female voices louder. The corridors of Newgrange in Ireland lit, once a year by a shaft of winter solstice sunlight, activating vibration patterns carved into the stone. These are not coincidences of culture, but continuations of memory. We call them primitive only because we have forgotten their language. Perfect corners even today. Engineers struggle to explain how certain granite stone boxes in Egypt were hollowed with such precision that their corners meet at perfect right angles within margins of a single millimeter. Machining that's smooth requires rotational control and constant pressure, something our ancestors supposedly lacked. Yet there it is, carved into unchangeable stone, mocking the pride of certainty. If there truly was an age of forgotten engineers, their disappearance was almost total. No instruction manuals, no workshops, no prototypes, only perfection left behind. It is as if they intended to vanish, erasing themselves to protect what they knew. Or perhaps they were erased by force, swallowed by an event that changed the planet, leaving only fragments for us to interpret as miracles. The language of creation, the ancient Egyptians credited their knowledge to the gods. Thoth, the keeper of sacred measurement, and Ta, the architect of the world. But in the Memphite theology, Ta is not divine in the way we think. He is the principle of thought made real, the union of sound, word, and creation. To build, therefore, was to speak the world into being. To cut stone was to align it with a frequency that allowed form to emerge effortlessly. Maybe that is why their temples still hum. When wind passes through the colossi of Memnon, the statues sing. When footsteps echo in the chambers of Luxor, the air vibrates with a tone older than words. The stones remember what the world has forgotten. And so the question lingers, buried like the obelisk in Aswan. Were the ancients truly primitive? Or are we the ones living in the ruins of a greater past, mistaking fragments of lost science for myth? If knowledge once had rhythm, if architecture once sang, then every monument we now study in silence was once part of a grand symphony, a civilization in tune with the earth itself. Perhaps the forgotten engineers were not gods, not aliens, not fantasies, but humans who remembered how to listen. When we stand among ruins, when we stand among the ruins of the ancient world, what are we really hearing? The wind against stone, or the echoes of something older, a vibration too deep for our instruments to record? Every civilization has left behind its monuments. But some of them hum, not metaphorically but physically. In the right frequency, in the right silence, a tone emerges, faint but precise, as though the stones themselves are speaking. Perhaps they are not ruins at all, but instruments that have long since fallen out of tune. Temples that amplify sound in Egypt, at the heart of the ancient temples of Karnak and Luxor, sound behaves strangely. Whisper in the hypostyle hall, and your voice returns to you in soft, spiraling delay. The air vibrates gently, as if the massive columns carved with the stories of creation are absorbing the vibration, bending it through their geometry. Sound engineers who have studied these chambers say the frequencies are too deliberate to be accidental. The dimensions make low tones louder, quiet high ones, and create standing waves that pulse against the skin. For the priests who once chanted hymns here, this was not decoration. It was function. Sound was sacred, not because it symbolized divinity, but because it was divinity. In the temples of Hathor at Dendera, beneath carved ceilings showing constellations and celestial boats, lies a crypt. Inside, reliefs show strange bulb-like shapes connected to what appear to be cords or tubes. Some say these represent lamps, early experiments in electricity, but others, especially those studying vibration, interpret them differently. They might symbolize vibration, light produced not by flame, but by sound. The hieroglyph for energy, or Heka, was the same used for magic. To the ancients, there was no difference. To speak was to summon. To sing was to shape. Sand that forms patterns. Modern experiments with sound confirm something curious. Frequencies between 90 and 120 Hz can cause sand to form geometric patterns, triangles, circles, spirals, on vibrating plates. The ancients called these patterns sacred geometry. They carved them on temple floors, obelisks, and stone boxes. They may have been maps or tools or both. Imagine a civilization that knew how to move stone not with force, but with harmony, tuning the material world like an instrument until it gave in. Across the desert at Saqqara, the Serapeum holds a series of massive granite boxes, each weighing up to 70 tons, carved from single blocks with mirror-smooth insides. The corridors around them make sound louder in such a way that even a whisper becomes a hum. When researchers played low-frequency tones within these chambers, the stone vibrated. The walls quivered, almost too slightly to see. One engineer described it as standing inside a throat. The ancients had created vibration chambers tuned to the pitch of the earth. But for what purpose? Chambers of consciousness. Perhaps these places were not tombs, but something more mysterious. Spaces designed to align human awareness with planetary vibration. The builders might have believed that by vibrating with the earth, they could access higher states of awareness, talk with the divine, or preserve memory itself. Every surface, every curve of stone was calculated to participate in that silent conversation. And then one day the conversation stopped. No one knows exactly when it happened, when chanting ceased, when the voices fell silent, when the temples closed their mouths to the wind. By the time the Greeks arrived, Egypt's sacred architecture had already lost its sound. The rituals continued, but their meaning had faded. The language of vibration was forgotten, and with it, a science that joined the spiritual with the physical. The silence of the builders is not just the absence of noise. It is the sound of a species forgetting its own vibration. The roar of machines. Perhaps the silence is why the world feels louder now. We replace the harmony of stone and voice with the roar of machines. Yet in doing so, We may have cut ourselves off from the frequencies that once bound us to the planet. Archaeologists often marvel at the precision of megalithic architecture, the balance, the impossible alignments, but they rarely ask why such precision was necessary. Why did the ancients work so hard to align pyramids with the stars to within tiny fractions of a degree? Why did they care so much about direction, vibration, and proportion? The answer may lie in the principle that the builders lived by. Harmony was not beauty. It was survival. In a universe of vibration, disorder is death. Göbekli Tepe's harmony. Consider Göbekli Tepe again, the circular temples buried under 12,000 years of soil. Their arrangement is not random. When reconstructed, the pillars form perfect harmonic ratios identical to those found in musical scales. The ancients might have stood within those circles to create vibration between earth and sky, echoing frequencies that kept both physical and spiritual balance. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe could then represent the silencing of that era, a closing note in a song too powerful to continue. Was that silence chosen or forced? There are stories, half myth, half warning, of civilizations punished for their pride, of builders who reached too far into the divine mechanics of the universe. Perhaps their knowledge was not lost, but hidden, sealed within structures that could survive disaster. Temples as tuning forks, pyramids as vibrators, monuments as coded data. Their survival into our age may be no accident. They stand as reminders, waiting for ears that can hear them again. We study their silence. The irony is that the ancients may have built with sound and memory, while we study their silence with machines. We strike their stones with hammers. We measure their angles, but we rarely listen. Yet sometimes, when the desert wind passes through the open corridors of Luxor or between the columns of Karnak, the air produces a tone, long, low, and haunting. Locals say it is the breath of the gods. Geologists call it vibration, but perhaps both are right. To listen is an act of humility, to admit that the past might still be speaking. And maybe that is what the builders intended all along, that their monuments would one day wake again, when the world grew quiet enough to remember what it had forgotten. For silence, too, is a form of sound, the final frequency of wisdom. The song still waits somewhere beneath the hum of modern life, beneath the noise of centuries. The song of the builders still lingers. It waits in the air between stone and wind, in the empty chambers of the pyramids, in the echo that returns after your last word fades. It waits for someone, anyone, to listen. Maps that whisper impossibilities. There are maps in our museums that whisper impossibilities. Pieces of parchment and leather, inked centuries ago, yet showing coastlines that should have been unknown. Antarctica drawn without ice, continents outlined before they were discovered, and longitudes mapped long before the invention of the tool to measure them. The most famous of them all rests quietly in the Topkapi Palace of Istanbul. The Piri Reis map, created in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Ahmed. It was supposedly a combination of older charts. He wrote in neat Ottoman script that his sources included 20 maps from ancient times, among them one drawn in the time of Alexander the Great. Yet what makes his map more than a curiosity is what it reveals. Alongside the familiar western coast of Africa and the precise outline of South America lies something startling. A detailed drawing of the northern coastline of Antarctica, free of ice. Antarctica without ice. According to modern geology, Antarctica has been buried beneath a kilometer of ice for more than 6,000 years. No human eyes could have seen its rocky shorelines at the time the map was made. And yet, when scientists placed Piri Reis's drawing over seismic surveys from the 20th century, the contours lined up almost perfectly with the land beneath the ice under Queen Maud Land. Coincidence, perhaps? But how could a 16th century sailor, armed only with primitive compasses and inherited scrolls, draw something that matches data collected by radar in the 1950s? Some historians argue that Piri Reis must have copied it from a far older source, a leftover from an advanced seafaring civilization long erased. Charles Hapgood, a scholar at Keene State College, proposed that the map preserved the memory of a pre-Ice Age seafaring culture that charted the world when Earth's geography was different. His theory, later mentioned by Albert Einstein in a letter, suggested that Antarctica had once been ice-free and lived in before a sudden crustal shift buried it under glaciers. Mainstream mapmakers dismissed the idea as fantasy. They insisted that the map's oddities were distortions caused by drawing errors or imagination. Yet the Piri Reis map was not alone. Other ancient maps, the Orontius Phineas map, drawn in 1531, also showed Antarctica's shape and mountain ranges without ice. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 showed the Americas joined to a continent at the South Pole, while the Bwatch map of 1737 traced Antarctic rivers that modern sonar later confirmed beneath the ice sheet. Too many errors line up too well. Could all these mapmakers have invented the same mistake? If the Piri Reis map truly comes from sources older than recorded history, then someone long before Egypt or Sumer must have mapped the globe. That would mean shipbuilding, navigation, astronomy, and mathematics far beyond what the ancient world supposedly had. To draw accurate coastlines, one must know latitude and longitude, which requires complex geometry and precise instruments. No such tools survive from ancient times, unless they were never meant to. Fossils of knowledge. Perhaps these maps are not oddities, but fossils of knowledge, fragments of a once complete understanding of the Earth. The ancients may have known the shape of the planet not through exploration, but through a different form of observation, one that joins sky and sea, astronomy and mapmaking. Ancient myth speaks of world grids, of lines of energy or paths connecting sacred sites. Today we call them ley lines. Some researchers guess that early maps may have been drawings of this invisible geometry, the world not as seen but as felt. What if the Piri Reis map was a copy of a map that had itself been copied 100 times across thousands of years? Each generation tracing the ghost of continents it no longer recognized. The ink would fade, the coastlines distort, but the memory would remain, carried like a secret through time. The lost library, the Library of Alexandria, before its destruction, was rumored to house thousands of ancient scrolls detailing global geography. Some fragments survived through Arab scholars who, during the Islamic Golden Age, translated Greek and Egyptian texts into Arabic. Piri Reis, a man of the Ottoman court, could easily have accessed those archives. Yet even those texts hinted that their sources were older still, from lands drowned by flood or lost in fire. When the Portuguese navigator Pedro Reynel produced his world chart in 1504, he added something no one had seen before: lines of magnetic declination, accurately predicting the Earth's magnetic variation centuries before it was scientifically measured. How could he know unless he too was drawing from a tradition that had already measured it long ago? A buried city. These oddities pile up like sand on a buried city. One grain means little, but enough of them, and you begin to see the outline of something vast beneath. The pattern suggests not scattered coincidence, but continuity. A legacy passed, hand to hand, scroll to scroll, until the original authors were forgotten. Imagine a civilization of navigators who mapped the world when the poles were warm, when ice had not yet claimed the southern continent. They sailed along coastlines that no longer exist, recorded the curve of the Earth, and encoded that knowledge into geometry and myth. When their world ended through flood, axis shift, or cosmic impact, survivors carried fragments of their charts to new shores, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to the Aegean. Their memory became legend, and legend became religion. A mirror in that sense. The Piri Reis map is not just a piece of paper. It is a mirror. It reflects both our curiosity and our forgetting. It tempts us to remember a time when humanity might have known the whole Earth closely, not as a collection of nations, but as a living thing, breathing, rotating, shifting beneath the stars. If we follow that thread further, another question comes up. Why did such knowledge vanish? Was it erased by disaster or by choice? Some scholars point to the uniform rewriting of history after each empire rises. How conquerors rebuild libraries, change calendars, rename constellations. Perhaps the destruction of ancient map-making archives was not merely loss, but cleansing, a way to cut the line of forbidden knowledge. Satellites and shadows today. Satellites map every meter of the planet. Yet we still cannot explain how fragments of that same global awareness existed thousands of years ago. It is as though the past was a reflection of our present, distorted by water and time. And maybe that is the quiet lesson these maps whisper from their glass cases. That discovery is not always progress, and knowledge does not always move forward. Sometimes it drifts in circles, coming back like an island once thought drowned. The lines inked by forgotten hands may have outlived their makers for a reason. They wait not to prove anything, but to remind us that the world has been known before, and that knowing can be lost. Somewhere beyond the edges of accepted history, there might still exist the original chart, the one drawn when the poles were green, the seas gentle and memory unbroken. If such a map were ever found, what would it show us? The world as it was, or the world as it will be again? Memory in stone. Some say that every stone holds a memory, and that when the wind brushes its surface, that memory breathes again. Not in words, but in patterns, vibrations, and silence. For centuries, archaeologists have brushed dust from ancient tablets, believing they were reading history. Yet what if some of those carvings were not meant to be read at all, but heard? What if the world's oldest libraries are not made of papyrus or parchment, but granite? Deep beneath the sands of Giza, there are rumors, half dismissed, half guarded, of a chamber sealed below the Sphinx's paws. Ancient texts call it the Hall of Records, a vault said to contain the wisdom of the forgotten age. It appears in the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus, in the Hermetic texts, and again in the readings of Edgar Cayce, who claimed that the keepers of Atlantis buried their archives there before the final flood. When seismic scans were done around the Sphinx in the 1990s, researchers indeed found oddities, empty spaces and voids, precisely where legend had placed them. Egypt's authorities quickly restricted further access, calling it structural preservation. But the rumor continued because silence is often the loudest evidence. Geometry as encryption. If there truly is a vault beneath the Sphinx, its purpose may not have been to hide physical scrolls, but to preserve geometry, knowledge encoded in proportion, alignment, and vibration. Ancient builders spoke through stone. The pyramids themselves could be read like a text if one knew the language of measure. The ratio of height to base echoing pi, the inner chambers forming the golden mean, the positioning mirroring star coordinates. This is not coincidence. It is encryption. Göbekli Tepe, the 12,000-year-old sanctuary in modern-day Turkey, may be the oldest example of this language. Its towering T-shaped pillars bear carvings of foxes, vultures, serpents, and celestial symbols arranged with mathematical precision. Some researchers, such as Andrew Collins and Klaus Schmidt, propose that these carvings represent constellations, forming an astronomical code, perhaps a warning of a disaster the builders had witnessed. Buried deliberately under tons of earth, the site seems to have been hidden rather than abandoned, like a message sealed in time for those who would someday rediscover it. A universal language across the world. Similar stone archives exist. In Romania, the Tartaria tablets bear early writing older than Sumerian cuneiform. In Bolivia, Tiwanaku's Gate of the Sun encodes solar and lunar cycles through symbolic grids. In Egypt, temple walls repeat the same ratios found in Greek temples built thousands of years later. These are not coincidences, but echoes, signs that the same mathematical awareness once spanned continents. But what kind of civilization leaves behind only numbers and symbols? Perhaps one that understood that stone endures when stories fade. Paper burns, myths distort, but geometry survives. It is universal, immune to translation, unchanged by empire or faith. In that sense, megaliths were not just temples or tombs, they were sentences written in the language of forever. We are only beginning to translate them. The House of the Phoenix at Abu Ghurab, near Cairo, stands the ruined platform of an ancient solar temple built with red quartzite. In its center lies a massive alabaster basin with circular channels carved into its surface. Some claim it was used for rituals. Others say it worked as part of an energy device, a vibrating structure converting sunlight or sound into something else. The truth may lie between both interpretations. Ancient Egyptian texts describe the House of the Phoenix, where the light speaks through stone. The builders may have seen no boundary between physics and spirit. To measure was to pray. The same concept appears thousands of miles away in the stone discs of the Dropa caves in China's Biancarola Mountains. These circular artifacts, discovered in the 1930s, are etched with spiral grooves that look like phonograph recordings. Some researchers claimed they encoded a lost language or even a sound frequency pattern. Whether real or not, the symbolism is striking. knowledge stored as vibration, not writing. The word the ancients may have known what we're only rediscovering now. That information is vibration, and vibration is eternal. Even myths of the word, the creative logos spoken by gods, might be memories of this ancient science. To speak the world into being is to shape it through vibration. The builders, then, were not mystics but scientists of a subtler kind. They left messages not in words, but in harmonics, embedding their understanding of the cosmos into temples that vibrate, obelisks that hum, and pyramids that pulse with geometry. Decoding the pyramids, some have tried to decode these messages. The mathematician Livio Catullo Stecchini once noted that the Great Pyramid's base encodes the ratio between the Earth's radius and its polar distance around, knowledge supposedly unknown to the ancients. Others found that its internal passageways match the slow wobble of the equinoxes, marking cycles of time spanning thousands of years. It is as if the pyramid itself is a calendar or a memory device, recording the rhythm of cosmic ages. The same urge to preserve knowledge through form appears in myth. The biblical Ark of the Covenant, built to precise proportions and covered with gold, produces strong electromagnetic vibration according to modern tests. In Hindu tradition, the Sri Yantra, a geometric diagram of interlocking triangles, encodes equations of energy flow identical to those found in quantum physics. Different cultures, same pattern, geometry as revelation. A planetary brain, if all of this is true, then what we call sacred. Architecture may have been the ancient world's way of remembering, a distributed archive of frequencies, ratios, and harmonics scattered across continents. Together, they form a network like neurons in a planetary brain, each monument holding a fragment of the total code. The loss of one civilization would not erase the whole. The knowledge was designed to survive disaster, to reawaken when the next cycle began. But what if that reawakening is happening now? Modern technology, lasers, magnetic imaging, harmonic scanning, has begun to reveal hidden balances within these monuments that mirror modern physics. What we once dismissed as superstition now appears as design. Perhaps this is the beginning of the rediscovery phase, the moment when the silence of the stones begins to dissolve. Danger in knowing still, there is danger in knowing too quickly. The ancients may have buried their archives for a reason. Knowledge once freed from wisdom becomes a weapon. The builders may have seen the temptation of power, the same power that destroyed their world. By encoding their wisdom in stone, they ensure that only those who could read through feeling and patience would ever unlock it again. The Hall of Records, then, may not be a chamber of scrolls, but the earth itself, the entire planet as one vast monument of memory. Every mountain, every temple, every geometric alignment is part of a forgotten sentence still being written. And perhaps somewhere beneath the pause of the Sphinx, the final word waits. The one that, when spoken, will remind us not only of who built these wonders, but why they stopped. When history drowns, sometimes history doesn't end, it drowns. Beneath the steady rhythm of geological time, the earth has spasms, sudden, violent corrections that erase almost everything. Civilizations may flourish for thousands of years, but the planet needs only one bad night to scatter them into myth. The evidence of such nights is everywhere. Scorched rock, melted sand, sudden layers of ash and mud, animal bones tangled with human tools. The world resets itself, and memory begins again. The Younger Dryas, one such reset may have happened around 12,800 years ago, at the boundary between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. To geologists, it is called the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to icy cold after thousands of years of warming. To storytellers, it was the Great Flood. In both versions, it was an ending. Across North America, scientists have found a thin layer of blackened soil, the black mat, filled with platinum, microspherules, and nanodiamonds, materials that can form only under huge heat. This layer matches with the sudden extinction of mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. Some researchers, such as Richard Firestone and Alan West, propose that a massive comet or fragments of one struck the ice sheets of North America, triggering global fires, dust in the air, and floods of meltwater. Others dismiss it as coincidence. Yet the layer is global. It appears in Syria, South America, and even Antarctica. If the impact theory is correct, then the flood myths of the world may be eyewitness accounts of real disaster, stories carried by survivors who watched their world burn and drown. Stories of fire and flood. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, the Hindu Matsya Purana, the Greek Deucalion, and the biblical Noah all describe not just flooding, but destruction by fire followed by darkness. The fountains of the deep were broken up, says Genesis. The sun vanished, says the Popol Vuh of the Maya. Sounds less like moral story and more like trauma. When the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose over 100 meters. Entire coastlines vanished. Whatever civilizations had lived there, the coastal builders of Heracleion, the navigators who mapped the poles, the astronomers of Göbekli Tepe, would have lost everything. Those who survived would have wandered inland, carrying fragments of knowledge like salvaged fire. Over generations, that fire cooled into myth. Sudden maturity, perhaps that is why, when the first temples appeared in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, they seemed to begin at full maturity. Architecture, agriculture, astronomy all appeared suddenly, as if remembered rather than invented. The Sumerians said their kingship descended from heaven. The Egyptians spoke of Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods walked among men. These are not creation myths, but memories of restoration. The moment when the world rebooted itself and memory returned in fragments. The disaster may have been both physical and psychological. To survive such collapse is to live among ghosts. Imagine watching the sea swallow your cities, the sky filled with fire, the stars hidden in ash. Would you not vow never to forget? Yet over centuries, inevitably, you forget anyway. Monuments as memory. The survivors may have built monuments as places of collective grief. Pyramids and stone circles as memory devices to ensure that what came before would never fully vanish again. Geological records confirm how fast the change was. In less than 2 decades, global temperatures dropped by as much as 8 degrees Celsius. Glaciers advanced, ocean currents shifted, and rainfall patterns collapsed. Entire ecosystems vanished. It was a world in freefall. Yet from this chaos came the first seeds of civilization. The same chaos that destroyed the old world forced humanity to organize, to measure, to build. A warning in stone at Göbekli Tepe, built around 9,500 BCE, right after the Younger Dryas, we see the fingerprints of this rebirth. Its circular temples, carved with celestial symbols, suggest a people obsessed with the sky, perhaps desperate to understand what had destroyed them. Some of the carvings show a comet raining from heaven, striking a vulture, the same constellation pattern known today as Sagittarius. In 2017, researchers at the University of Edinburgh suggested that the site records a cosmic impact date around 10,950 BCE, exactly when the Younger Dryas began. If true, then Göbekli Tepe was not a temple of worship, but of remembrance, a warning carved in stone. Fragments carried forward. The survivors of the disaster might have scattered outward, to the Nile, the Indus, the Andes. Wherever they went, they built the same things. Megaliths aligned to the stars, temples encoded with geometry, calendars synchronized to solstices. These were not the works of primitive tribes, but the conscious restoration of a lost science. Civilization, in this sense, is less an invention than a recovery. But recovery carries its own danger. Each rebirth must simplify what it restores. Languages lose detail. Rituals lose purpose. Technologies lose context. What once was science becomes symbol. The builders who once harmonized stone and sound become priests chanting formulas they no longer understand. And so the wisdom of one age becomes the religion of the next. Trauma that never fades. Perhaps that is why our myths still ache with fear of water and fire. The memory of destruction never fully fades. It surfaces in prophecies of apocalypse, in tales of divine anger, in our obsession with the end of days. We have inherited not the knowledge of the lost civilization, but its trauma. And yet, through all that forgetting, fragments survived. In the precise alignments of Stonehenge, in the astronomical lore of the Dogon people of Mali, who somehow knew of Sirius's invisible companion star, in the Vedic hymns describing the Earth's slow wobble and the age of the cosmos. Each is a shard of something larger, a mosaic shattered and scattered by time. An echo of the last. If we are indeed the descendants of those who rebuilt after the flood, then every generation since has been another attempt to recover what was lost. Science and spirituality, long divided, may be two halves of the same inheritance, one studying what remains visible, the other listening for what was drowned. And perhaps the greatest irony is that we, with all our satellites and sensors, are still haunted by the same question that kept those ancient astronomers awake beneath a different sky. What comes next? Will the cycle repeat? The Earth still tilts, still wobbles, still circles the sun with a heartbeat measured in thousands of years. Comets still cross our path. Ice still melts. Maybe every civilization is just an echo of the last, rising and falling with the rhythm of cosmic breath. Messages for the unborn. The ancients may have known this and built their monuments as warnings, time capsules, and prayers. We call them ruins, but they might be messages, reminders etched in stone, saying, "We were here once. We saw the sky fall. Remember us when it happens again." If so, then every pyramid is not a tomb, but a lighthouse, one that shines not for the dead, but for the unborn. The gatekeepers of memory. Every civilization tells stories about its origins, yet none like to speak of its gaps. Between what we know and what we believe lies a silence, carefully tended, not an accident of time, but a design. For history is not only written by victors, it is managed by gatekeepers. And those gatekeepers, whether priests, emperors, or academics, decide not only what survives but what never existed at all. It is easy to forget that, for much of human history, knowledge was property. In Egypt, only the priesthood of Heliopolis could read the sacred language of the gods. In medieval Europe, the church controlled both reading and memory, copying manuscripts that suited their beliefs and burning those that did not. Even in our modern age, where archives seem endless and free, we manage through leaving things out, deleting inconvenient data, ignoring the unexplainable. The archive is not a mirror. It is a filter. Sorting the sands in the 19th century, when Western archaeologists first began digging in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they arrived not to learn but to sort. The sands were organized like filing cabinets. Civilizations were ranked by progress, and anything that did not fit the evolutionary model of history was quietly set aside. Perfectly machined vases, odd maps, unexplained wearing away, labeled curiosities, not evidence. To admit they were genuine would require rewriting everything, and rewriting, in science as in religion, is like saying something forbidden. Sir William Flinders Petrie, one of the founding fathers of modern Egyptology, once unearthed a series of diorite bowls so finely carved they couldn't be copied with tools available at the time. He recorded them carefully, but their implications, that the Egyptians may have inherited advanced machining techniques, were buried along with his notes. The artifacts remain in museums, but their story was rewritten in labels. The same happens still. The same happens still. When discoveries contradict the timeline, they are stored, not studied. Why? Because history is not just about what happened, but about what must have happened to keep the illusion of continuity. The official story, linear, progressive, evolutionary, is comforting. It tells us we are the peak of everything before us, not the fragments of something greater. If an older, more advanced civilization once existed, that illusion shatters. Humanity would no longer be the author of its own rise, but a survivor of its own forgetting. Archives that guard too well. Even the institutions meant to protect knowledge sometimes guard it too well. The Vatican archives, stretching over 80 kilometers of shelving, hold countless manuscripts that no outsider has ever read. Among them, it is said, lie pre-Christian scrolls rescued from Alexandria before its burning, texts that describe gods not as supernatural beings, but as teachers of forgotten sciences. Access is limited to a select few. For preservation, they say, but preservation and secrecy are twins. In 1945, a set of papyrus books buried in the sands of Nag Hammadi revealed teachings that had been erased from Christianity for nearly 2,000 years. Writings that spoke of divinity as knowledge, not obedience. Their discovery was accidental, their translation delayed, and their publication resisted. How many other archives still sleep beneath desert and monastery, waiting for accidents to unseal them? Academic gatekeeping. The pattern repeats even in our age of science. In 1991, when Robert Schoch presented geological evidence that the Sphinx was thousands of years older than dynastic Egypt, academic institutions closed ranks. His findings were not debated but dismissed. When Graham Hancock proposed that an advanced Ice Age civilization may have come before Egypt and Sumer, his work was labeled pseudoscience before it was read. The gatekeepers change their robes, but not their role. Orthodoxy defends itself by silence as much as by argument. And yet cracks always appear. Independent researchers, explorers, and forgotten texts slip through the filters. A photograph of an underwater temple here, a writing misfiled there. The age of the internet has turned secrecy into a kind of theater. The harder something is denied, the more insistently it spreads. We no longer need inquisitors. The algorithm does it for us, drowning inconvenient truths beneath waves of trivia. Custodians of a fragile story, but perhaps it is unfair to imagine conspiracy in every locked archive. The gatekeepers may not be villains at all, but custodians of a fragile story. For if humanity were to learn that its past is older and more repeating than we imagine, that civilizations rise and fall like tides, it would undo the illusion of permanence on which modern identity rests. We define ourselves as progress. Without that, what remains? Hidden in plain sight, still, one wonders what might be hiding in plain sight. The Cairo Museum, for instance, holds over 120,000 artifacts, yet only a fraction are displayed. Many remain boxed, mislabeled, or forgotten. The British Museum's basement contains thousands of items never catalogued since their 19th century arrival. The Smithsonian has quietly lost hundreds of skeletons of unusual size discovered in North America in the early 1900s, dismissed as errors, yet reported in local newspapers of the time. The pattern is consistent. Oddities vanish when they cannot be explained. The timeline stretches, yet silence has its limits. Each generation of scholars digs a little deeper, finding the edges of forgotten truths. Radiocarbon dating, satellite imaging, and ground-penetrating radar have exposed structures beneath the Amazon rainforest, the Sahara, and the Antarctic ice, all older than known civilizations. Every discovery stretches the timeline further back, forcing the official story to yield inch by inch. The resistance grows quieter with each adjustment, as though the gatekeepers themselves are tiring of guarding the past. Perhaps they sense that the story is changing on its own. The Earth remembers. The Earth, after all, remembers better than we do. When glaciers melt and deserts shift, they reveal what secrecy once buried. The disaster that destroyed the old world may also have buried its libraries, but also preserved them. Floods seal, ash protects, sand insulates. The destruction of one age becomes the archive of the next. The question is not whether forbidden knowledge exists, but when humanity will be ready to read it again. Maybe that readiness has little to do with intellect and everything to do with humility, the willingness to see ourselves not as masters of history, but as its students. Shadows with teeth. The gatekeepers of history have always feared chaos. But perhaps the greater danger lies in silence. For every truth held back becomes a shadow, and shadows left too long grow teeth. The past is not lost. It is merely under quarantine. And like all quarantines, it cannot last forever. When the seals finally break, when the sand gives way, when the archives open, when the forgotten voices speak again, what will they tell us? That we are the first or the last? The answer may not flatter us, for the keepers of memory cannot hold back time. The gate they guard is already opening, grain by grain, breath by breath. And through that widening crack, something older than history is beginning to whisper once more. At the edge of memory, at the edge of every civilization lies a threshold, a point where memory dissolves into myth, where the known fades into the silent hum of what came before. For centuries, humanity has stood on that threshold, staring backward into the mist, wondering who built the world we inherited. The pyramids, the megaliths, the sunken cities, all feel less like beginnings than leftovers. Perhaps what we call history is only the morning after an age whose night we have forgotten. Survivors rebuilding. If that is true, then our ancestors were not primitive dreamers groping toward reason, but survivors rebuilding after loss, the heirs of a knowledge too vast to carry whole. The Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time. The Maya called it the previous sun. The Hindus called it the end of one yuga and the dawn of another. Every ancient culture repeats the same rhythm. Creation, destruction, rebirth. The world does not progress in a line. It circles. And we are somewhere near the turn. Echoes in our bones, what remains of those who came before us is scattered not only in ruins but in us. In our bones, our language, our imagination. Myths of giants, floods, and fire are not inventions of fear, but echoes of memory. When we dream of lost continents or forgotten gods, perhaps we're hearing something older than imagination, the genetic whisper of a time period erased by the earth itself. Modern science calls these legends coincidence, the byproduct of human pattern-making. Yet when the same stories appear on every continent, separated by oceans and thousands of years, coincidence begins to sound like denial. The same teacher across cultures, the same characters emerge. The teacher who descends from the sky, the flood that cleans the world, the rebuilder who carries the seed of civilization. In Sumer, he was Oannes, the amphibious sage from the sea. In Mesoamerica, he was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who taught writing and timekeeping. In Egypt, Thoth, lord of measurement and knowledge. Different names, one memory. These stories imply a chain of continuity, a civilization that once spanned the globe in spirit, if not in empire, guided by a unified language of number, proportion, and star. Encoded for eternity. If such a civilization existed, it did not vanish because it was weak, but because the earth shifted beneath it. The cosmic clock struck midnight, and the world began again. But fragments of that earlier light endured, encoded in myths, in maps, in monuments too vast to erase. Perhaps this is why every great culture seems obsessed with permanence. The builders of stone did not trust words. They built for forever. They aligned their temples with the stars, synchronized their calendars to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, and buried their knowledge where only patience could retrieve it. To them, time was not a river, but a tide, inevitable, repeating, and merciless. They built knowing they would be forgotten, yet trusting that someone someday would remember. And now we stand among their shadows, trying to remember. When we look at the night sky, the same constellations that guided them still burn. Orion still rises over Giza as it did 12,000 years ago. The Pleiades still shimmer above the Andes. The Milky Way still arcs across the heavens, reflected in the rivers and myths of Earth. In that sense, the stars are the oldest library, a constant above a shifting world. Maybe the ancients built their monuments not to worship the heavens, but to anchor memory to something unchanging. If their message survived, what does it say? Some scholars believe the geometry of megalithic structures encodes harmonic ratios, the same ratios found in planetary orbits, in music, even in DNA. These are not mere coincidences, but fingerprints of unity, reminders that all forms, from galaxies to cells, follow the same pattern. The ancients might have understood that creation is vibration, that every atom, every soul vibrates in sympathy with the cosmos. Their monuments were not declarations of power, but of participation. They did not dominate the earth. They talked with it. What would it mean for us, the so-called moderns, to remember this? Could we still hear that vibration, buried beneath our noise? Perhaps that is what these ruins are asking of us. Not to worship the past, but to listen to it. There is a theory, poetic more than scientific, that the human species itself is a vessel for memory, that evolution is not random progress, but a process of remembering. Each generation rediscovers what the last forgot. We are drawn to mysteries not because they are foreign, but because they are familiar. The lost civilization before Egypt, before Sumer, before everything we call history, maybe it is not gone at all. Maybe it speaks through us every time we carve, measure, or wonder. And yet, even as we search for origins, the earth keeps rewriting the script. Ice melts, deserts shift, coastlines retreat. Once again, the climate changes faster than we can record it. We think we're watching the end of the world, but perhaps we're only witnessing another turn of the wheel. The ancients warned of cycles, not punishment, but renewal. What if what's coming is not the apocalypse, but another beginning? Still, there is sadness in knowing how fragile memory is. The pyramids will outlive our cities. The stone circles will still stand when our satellites fall from the sky. Maybe that was always the point, to leave a message not in words but in silence. A silence that endures. And in that silence, there is a question. One that no archaeologist can answer, no historian can translate. Why did they stop? If the ancients held knowledge that could align earth and sky, if they understood harmony and energy and balance, why did they bury it? Perhaps they knew what every civilization eventually learns. That power, even sacred power, corrodes. That every flame left unchecked burns its bearer. So they hid it. They let the sand take it. They trusted time to be the final guardian. Now we walk the surface of that inheritance, mistaking ruins for relics, and relics for riddles. But maybe the true secret is not hidden under stone at all. Maybe it has been above us all along, written in the motion of stars, waiting for us to remember how to read. Someday the last monument will crumble, and even the Sphinx will bow to the sand again. The sky will be different, but its rhythm the same. Another people will rise, look at the remnants of our cities, and wonder who we were and what we forgot. And in that distant future, they will listen to the hum of the earth, to the wind passing over broken towers, and they will hear what we hear now. The echo before the dawn, repeating through forever. You were not the first.